So this afternoon, I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing in Boulder County with the Boulder County Going Local campaign and why. And I'll start with the why. This is something that we don't get a chance to talk about often enough, so I want to spend a little bit of time this afternoon. I want to thank you all, first of all, for participating in the Renaissance of Local this weekend. We consider this to be an historic occasion. Boulder County's first Renaissance of Local. It will be an annual event, and it really is a great privilege to be here with everybody this weekend. And what we're doing here reminds me of what Wes Jackson once said. If you are working on something that you can finish in your lifetime, you're not thinking big enough. I want to start with a little bit of historical perspective to just establish a clear sense of where we are and where we're going. And of course, many of us already know or intuit most of these things, but once in a while, it's useful to just step back and take a look at all of this from a larger perspective and let our attention go to a broader horizon for a while. In the last couple of hundred years, our human population has exploded upon this planet, and this has been made possible by abundant and cheap fossil fuels. In this incredibly brief period in time, we've been busily building an entire globalized economy based upon the values of bigger, faster, and more. Economic development powered by cheap and abundant oil has chewed up farmlands, devastated forests, made dead zones out of oceans, dried up rivers and aquifers, and has spewed vast quantities of wastes and toxins into our atmosphere, into our precious water supplies, fouling our biosphere, not to mention our own bodies. In the process, we have essentially lost our connections with the earth, with the sky, with other living creatures on whom we depend. We have lost our connections with each other, with the sacredness of life, with the natural processes and cycles that are fundamental to all life. We have lost our connection with spirit and with the larger universe, the greater community in which we all live. And if this process were to continue for much longer, the devastation would be complete, and the long list of species becoming extinct would quickly include our own, and we would lose everything. But the process of economic globalization will not continue for long. It has just about run its course. We're now witnessing awesome feedback from all over the planet that tells us that economic globalization is just about to hit a wall. And this feedback is so profound that it is even raising serious questions about the future of humanity. So there are some things that we need to know about and get clear about, things that will inform how each of us prepares for the future and how we prepare our communities. And first of all, of course, we have to know that the age of cheap fossil fuels is rapidly coming to a close. Because our entire global economy is based upon an abundant supply of inexpensive oil, and because we've abandoned the knowledge and capacities that we possessed in the era before cheap oil, and because almost no one anywhere in the world is preparing for peak oil, I'm afraid that we're in for some pretty dramatic and uncomfortable shocks. The pundits like to call these shocks economic dislocations. And what that dispassionate term means, unfortunately, is that it's likely that billions of people will suffer, and probably millions of people will die. What it means is that we will all be forced into sweeping changes that we do not want. It means that our freedoms are likely to be compromised in the process, and that we will have to quickly adapt to new realities, much like the people of Cuba did when the Soviet Union collapsed and their supply of oil was cut off almost overnight. There's a lot of denial about this in this country because following our national oil production peak in 1970, we were able to compensate and continue our economic growth by importing more oil from other countries. No problem. And we have kind of come to expect that we'll always be able to get more from somewhere else. But once we've reached the global peak of oil production, the world will not be able to compensate by importing more oil from other planets. This will come as a rude shock to many people's assumptions. And of course, as has been pointed out, we can't say exactly or with certainty when peak oil will occur or exactly how rapid the decline in supply will be. But we can say that the balance between global supply and demand is extremely fragile and that any number of events could tip the balance to produce some very rough bumps in the road. And we can say that the peaking of global oil supply is inevitable, if not already upon us, as some have suggested. And we can say that many of the most dedicated researchers are clustering their predictions of peak around the years 2010 to 2012. And that's a bit alarming because the risk mitigation experts are telling us that we need a 10 to 20-year all-out crash program to prepare for peak oil if we are to avoid devastating economic consequences. Almost nobody believes that we have 20 years. Very few believe that we have 10 years. Most insist that we have 5 years or less. We need to listen to the voices that are rising up here, for they are risking their careers in many cases to get a message to us. And that message is peak oil will hit us soon and it will hit us hard. And there are now very strong indications that we do not have sufficient time or sufficient capital resources to develop alternatives of sufficient scale to avoid a prolonged period of intense suffering, even in this country. The Hirsch report says, "The world has never faced a problem like this without massive mitigation. The problem will be pervasive and will not be temporary. Previous energy transitions were gradual and evolutionary. Oil peaking will be abrupt and revolutionary." Certainly there will be alternatives to oil, but as Steve Andrews, Richard Heinberg, and Julian Darley made amply clear here yesterday and last night, those alternatives will not come on stream quickly enough or at large enough scale to maintain our current way of life. Recently, we found this simple graphic which represents the amount of oil consumption, roughly, in the world today. 1 cubic mile of oil per year. It's an enormous quantity of oil, and the energy that is embedded in that cubic mile of oil is just astonishing. And scientists at SRI attempted to see what it would take to replace this amount of energy to maintain our current way of life. And so these are some of the equivalents that they came up with. We could get to this rate of energy if we built 4 gorges dams a year, every year for the next 50 years. At the end of that 50 years, we would be at that equivalent of 1 cubic mile of oil. If we built 52 nuclear power plants a year for the next 50 years, by the end of that 50 years, we would be at that equivalent of 1 cubic mile of oil worth of energy. 104 coal-fired plants per year for 50 years, and on and on. It gives us just a small idea of the enormous amount of energy that we're consuming each year, and it can't continue. But peak oil is just the first global crisis that we will experience in our lifetimes, not just read about, the first of a series of global crises that James Howard Kunstler has called the long emergency. And the second global crisis, of course, is global warming and climate change. And we all know that it's a far more vast and serious problem than peak oil. But our ability to respond to peak oil will be, to global warming will be directly affected by peak oil. And interestingly, many who are studying global warming and climate change are not paying attention to peak oil, even though the two are directly interrelated. And the relationship between peak oil and climate change becomes crystal clear when we realize that in the United States, with less than 5% of the world's population, we are consuming 25% of the world's oil resources. And we also produce around 25% of the world's greenhouse gases. This is not a coincidence. And some writers have been suggesting recently that in view of global warming, peak oil is happening just in time. Otherwise, continuing to burn oil on the planet at the rate we are now would simply overwhelm the atmosphere. And I'm afraid that their optimism is a little bit unfounded, because as oil becomes more scarce and more expensive, many nations who now want the same kind of lifestyle that we enjoy here in the United States will turn to coal. And because they're in such a hurry to develop, like China and India are, they will be unlikely to be very careful about their emissions or their waste streams. The problem is that a third of the world doesn't want to ride bicycles anymore. They want what we have, and they're never going to have it. And we're never going to be able to keep it. It's true that there's far more public awareness of global warming now than there was a year ago. But my concern is that it still doesn't go very deep. Many people saw Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth and left feeling that if we would all just change our light bulbs and buy a Prius, everything will be just fine. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that everything will not be just fine. The truth, it turns out, is not just inconvenient. And while the effects of global warming and climate change may not be immediate, they will be profound and very long-term. Of course, it's good that there is increased public awareness, but we must realize that the media has not yet caught up to the science. The frontline researchers are saying that the situation is far worse than we have been told by the media or the government, and they're having a tough time getting the word out. Some of them, surprisingly, are even wondering just how much of the truth the public really needs to know. And in that regard, I want to just share a little story that I heard in Boulder. It may be somewhat apocryphal, but I believe that it's symbolic. There is a certain climate scientist in Boulder who has to remain anonymous, who heads up a team of climate researchers who have been studying the melting of the polar ice caps. And last summer, when they assembled all their data, ran it through their supercomputers to see what the future looked like for the polar ice caps, the results were so shocking that they were sure something was wrong with the model. So they ran everything again through the supercomputers, got the same result. By this time, they were really worried, but they ran it all again, and third time, the results were exactly the same. And the results indicated that polar ice on this planet, that's both North and South Pole, will be gone, 70% gone, by the year 2012. That's right, year 2012. Now, that study has not been published. It hasn't been publicly discussed. And I don't know why that is, but maybe that tells us something. If we have been paying attention to the evidence that's been made available to us, and if we've been listening to what our hearts are telling us, by now it is clear enough that the impacts from global warming are going to be far more severe and arrive far more quickly than almost any of us have thought. Not only must we cut our carbon emissions drastically, immediately, but we must also prepare for the impacts of the damage that we have already unleashed. The third great global crisis of the long emergency inevitably is economic. For some time now, we've been hearing rumblings that the dollar is on the verge of collapse. Well, of course it is, because the U.S. economy is based upon cheap fossil fuels. And the dollar is backed by faith and little else. And the entire global economy is based upon the U.S. dollar. What it means is that the whole system is very, very fragile. So we stand on the brink of an unprecedented economic discontinuity. As Colin Campbell says, the second half of the age of oil now dawns and will be marked by the decline of oil and all that depends upon it, including financial capital. It heralds the collapse of the present financial system and the related political structures. I am speaking of a second Great Depression. James Howard Kunstler says, the world oil production peak represents an unprecedented economic crisis that will wreak havoc on national economies, topple governments, alter national boundaries, provoke military strife, and challenge the continuation of civilized life. And certainly the impacts of global warming, drought, desertification, famine, coastal flooding, massive immigration, unprecedented hurricanes and cyclones, all these will have huge economic impact. So these three converging global crises, peak oil, global warming, economic instability, represent what we call a perfect global storm, bringing with it massive waves of change. This situation is absolutely unprecedented in human history. And if we were facing only one of these global crises, it would be difficult enough. But with the three together converging, that introduces dynamics that have never been seen before. And like the residents of New Orleans, in the face of Katrina, we are almost completely unprepared. And the point of all of this is to say that we are facing a very challenging, very difficult transition ahead. And we must make sure that we do not minimize or underestimate just how challenging it's going to be. We need to be pretty thorough in our preparation, and we must take great care, each one of us, to strengthen ourselves physically, economically, psychologically, spiritually, so that we can actually be of service in this difficult time. What we're witnessing here and what we're engaged in is simply the moment in the evolution of a particular species, us, in which we have reached the end of species adolescence. And we must now make the transition to adulthood. Humanity is not doomed, we're not fatally flawed or a failure, far from it. We must simply grow up. And to do that, we've got to be very realistic, not driven by either fatalistic fear or unrealistic hope. So in a way, those of us who are here this weekend are at the very fulcrum of human evolution. But whether humanity passes through this threshold to adulthood will be determined by people like us and by others who are gathering all over the country and all over the planet considering these questions. David Holmgren, one of the two founders of permaculture, who, by the way, is very, very busy these days, expressed much of this in a very succinct conceptual diagram, charting the relationship between energy consumption and human population growth. Energy consumption and human population are both peaking, partly because cheap fossil fuels are peaking on the planet. And of course, as Richard Heinberg pointed out last night, lots of other things are peaking as well. But on the other side of this particular peak is an inevitable decline. Where we are at this moment is at the beginning of a transition from an industrial growth culture to a culture of descent. And this transition is likely to be characterized by much cultural chaos. And then we will be declining or descending to a far more sustainable, low-energy culture. Regarding this decline, Holmgren says, we have trouble visualizing decline as positive, but this simply reflects the dominance of our prior culture of growth. The real issue of our age is how we make a graceful and ethical descent. And one of the most compelling examples of a plan for making this descent is Kinsale, Ireland's Energy Descent Action Plan, which was published in 2005. It was generated by students of the world's first two-year residential permaculture course. And this plan that they generated was adopted in totality by the town of Kinsale, Ireland. What a tremendous legacy for those students. And in fact, what they developed here spawned a movement in the United Kingdom called transition towns. And there are now about 35 towns that have been developing similar kinds of plans. And I think it tells us that we need to view the long emergency as a defining moment for ourselves and for our species, for our communities, for each of us individually. For our legacy and the future of life on this planet will be determined how we respond to the challenges and the opportunities of the long emergency. And we need to understand that the long emergency is not a problem that can be solved. I'll say that again. The long emergency is not a problem that can be solved. It is a long-term consequence of our own actions to which we must adapt. And I like what Heinberg says about this. It's like growing old. You can't solve that. However, you can choose to respond respectfully, wisely, and imaginatively to it so that even aging can be a source of unexpected resources or unexpected riches. So it's the end of childhood for us. And Kunstler provides a wonderful way of looking at this. He says, let us give thanks for this extraordinary period of human history we have lived through. Let us recognize that we are moving into a new phase of history. Let's be brave and wise about it and prepare to move on. And I think our situation is not too dissimilar from the characters in this cartoon. What do you want to be if you grow up? So how do we make this transition to a more localized economy in a carbon-constrained world? Before I talk about what we're doing here, what we're attempting to do in Boulder County, there are just some ideas I'd like us to consider while we're standing at this threshold that I think might apply to all of us. The first thing to say is that technology is probably not the solution. And I think I've grown wary of those people who insist upon technological solutions to the problems that we face. because partly technologies have gotten us into the mess that we have now. If we believe that technology will solve the dilemma that we have, that we can continue to fuel economic growth by some other means, then I think we are being seduced by precisely the same fundamental error that has produced the conundrum that we have now. We must come to see that the solutions are not technological, but fundamentally human. The answers lie deep within the human spirit, and our ability to successfully navigate the transition that we must now go through will depend, most of all, on our willingness to know what we really know and to follow what we know. What's at stake here, fundamentally, is human freedom. And here's the principle that I think that we're learning. As long as we are dependent upon distant sources and foreign powers for our most essential needs, then our freedom is at risk. Because we can be forced to pay whatever price we must in order to survive. And that's exactly how freedom can be sacrificed in the name of survival. Our only viable alternative is to learn how to provision our essential needs locally. This is the heart of the strategy of relocalization. It means developing community self-sufficiency in energy, food, and economy, strengthening our local economies so as to not be vulnerable to national and global economic volatility. If human civilization is to survive in the context of freedom, we can only do so as a community of self-reliant communities who have adopted relocalization strategies as ethical and evolutionary imperatives. This begins by building a regional network of interdependent communities in our own bioregion, a process that's already beginning here in Colorado. I think it's important to say that our most essential resource on this planet is really community. It's also our most endangered resource. Through the process of economic globalization and the advent of a culture of profligate consumption, community has become our scarcest and most threatened resource. As Peggy Holman once said, the opposite of war is not peace, it is community. A fossil fuel-based culture of consumption and the economic globalization that it spawns actually destroys community. I think this is one of the great lessons of the relocalization movement. Only by building community self-sufficiency in energy, food, and economy can we preserve what's most important about the human species and ensure the future of human evolution. Then lastly here, the only form of life, it turns out, that is sustainable is community. Our success is likely to be measured by the degree to which we become one human community on this planet. Only on this kind of a foundation can we develop a platform for sustainable life on this planet. This is our greatest common need and the greatest gift that we can bring forth. I'll end this little part of this talk with this quote from Paul Hawken. The gift of the multiple crises we face is that in order to address them successfully, we will have to fundamentally change who we are. Some say people don't change, but they do when they have to. And part of that change is the capacity to listen, to put aside those things that separate us as unimportant, and honor the core values that unite us. So what's happening here in Boulder? Well, we began about 2.5 years ago with Boulder Valley Relocalization as a grassroots group responding to the peak oil crisis. We affiliated with Post Carbon Institute as one of their local groups. It's been an important affiliation, and as we have grown and learned over the last couple of years, we have felt given the urgency of the long emergency, that it was important to expand our efforts. And so early this year, we formed Boulder County Going Local, Inc. as a for-profit social venture, and on March 15th, we launched the Boulder County Going Local campaign. It's a campaign about building community self-sufficiency and strengthening the local economy through partnership, collaboration, and citizen engagement. It is a county-wide campaign setting the theme for what we see as a decade-long effort to make the transition to a stronger, more localized economy in an energy-constrained, carbon-constrained future. It was initiated by the founders of Boulder Valley Relocalization, myself included, organized by Boulder County Going Local, Inc. as a social venture, for-profit social venture, whose financial mission, by the way, is to support the work of Boulder Valley Relocalization and other nonprofits that we partner with, like Boulder Independent Business Alliance, BIBA, Boulder County Farmers Markets. We're also working with local and county governments, local growers, many, many citizens, lots and lots of people who are interested in these issues, wanting to develop a more secure and resilient community in the future. March 15th, we launched this campaign publicly. There were about 250 people who came out to support this. Tremendous amount of excitement around these issues. A number of sponsors came forward at that time to help make the work possible. Some of those sponsors are here in the room today. Many of them are at the expo here, and I would encourage you to visit them. The goals of the campaign are pretty simple. First of all, we want to celebrate and strengthen what we call a renaissance of local, and to begin reversing the local effects of economic globalization. We want to begin reweaving the fabric of connections that is at the heart of our community. We want to stimulate community economic self-reliance based upon local production of food, energy, goods, and services. We also want to increase public awareness of the need for community responses to over-reliance on cheap fossil fuels. And of course, we want to reduce energy consumption and carbon emissions to prepare our communities for this future. And finally, we want to catalyze actions at the community level here that can be implemented locally, but can become working models and inspiration for other communities as well. And the campaign is organized around a series of themes, which I'll talk about just briefly to give you an overview. First of all is buy local first. We want to promote the buying of goods and services locally first whenever that's possible, thus supporting locally owned independent businesses. And of course, buy local campaigns are beginning to spring up all over the country. We're aware of about 80 different communities that have been developing buy local campaigns, and these campaigns are increasing public awareness and changing consumer behavior. So it's really gratifying to see this happen, both through the work of AMIBA, the American Independent Business Alliance, and BALI, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. We'll be developing a Buy Local First coupon book very soon that will be modeled after what was done in Fort Collins. And if you haven't seen the Fort Collins Be Local coupon book, I encourage you to get a copy. It is a real inspiration and education. It's a very powerful public education and awareness tool. It increases traffic to the local businesses, builds customer loyalty, and provides a tremendous fundraiser for community groups. One of the outstanding examples of such coupon books is in Bellingham, Washington. They've just published their 4th edition. It's the #1 best-selling book in town, that is to say at the local bookstore. It's adding to wholesale, retail sales, increasing tax revenues, lots and lots of businesses participating. it's really exciting to see that happening there. The second theme is eat local. We want to support our local growers, our community-supported agriculture, the farmers markets, and promote those restaurants and stores who are offering locally grown food. And this part of the campaign is designed to bring a whole new awareness, energy, and vitality to our local food shed. We want to promote closer connections between our community and those who grow our food. Those are some of the kinds of connections that have been lost. And this issue has reached national attention, finally. Time magazine in mid-March published this on their cover: "Forget organic, eat local." When it hits Time magazine, we know that this is something that's been going on for a while and has been reaching a lot of people. This is good to see. Eat local campaigns, again, are beginning to happen all over the country, asking people to take the Eat Local challenge, even learn to eat from within 100 miles of where they live, the 100-mile diet. As part of the Eat Local campaign, hopefully you received when you came in a copy of our Eat Local resource guide. This is Boulder County's first guide to the local food shed, which we will be publishing annually. The edition that you saw here was our fall preview edition, but in the spring, our first annual edition will be available. And this magazine is filled with educational articles so that people can really understand the importance of our local growers and our local food shed. Third theme is grow local. We think it's very important to begin developing local food security every way that we can. And here's some of the background on why that's important. Our team of volunteers in Boulder Valley Relocalization calculated initially that with the current system of agriculture here in the county, we could only feed about 20,000 people, which is pretty astonishing. But if we really expanded the number of garden plots that there are, greenhouses in the area, if we increased the amount of farming going on for food, used more bio-intensive methods, and even reduced our calorie intake to a more simplified diet, we could maybe feed up to 185,000 people. And this is in a county of around 300,000 people. It's not that we're saying that we need to eat only food that's grown within Boulder County, but this does give us a benchmark here of our vulnerability in Boulder County and tells us why we need to be strengthening the local food shed. So we are encouraging people to learn to grow at least some of their own food. We're also wanting to expand farming in Boulder County, to expand those farms that are existing, to increase the development of new farms, and we want to help raise up a whole new generation of farmers in Boulder County. As Will Tour mentioned this morning, the population of farmers is aging, and there are not very many young people going into farming these days. It turns out in this country there are more farmers over the age of 65 than there are under the age of 30. So this is something that we need to pay serious attention to and to help raise up a new generation of farmers. To begin doing that, we're providing ongoing education in permaculture and bio-intensive methods of production. We're also getting people to volunteer at the local farms. It's a great way to learn. The fourth theme is local energy. And this is about developing appropriate community responses to the coming energy crisis, developing sustainable, local, renewable energy sources as much as possible. At this point, it's all about conservation and renewable energy education. And soon we will be following the example of Post Carbon Institute developing a local energy farm. There will be many different kinds of demonstrations of energy strategies, also working with the city to develop a peak oil resolution and plan for the city of Boulder. The fifth theme is one that most people are not that familiar with yet, but is becoming increasingly important. That is local currency. This is about channeling flows of economic energy locally, keeping economic power within the local economy. And we're talking about alternative currency here. One of the forms that we're all familiar with is frequent flyer miles, which is essentially a loyalty currency, but there are many other local currencies that are springing up around the country. One of them is happening in the Berkshires in New Hampshire called Berkshares, where now they have put into circulation a paper currency, over $1 million of that paper currency, which is a very powerful way to keep money within the local system. We're exploring systems like that in Boulder and Boulder County. Local currencies are important because they can liberate unused or latent resources within the community to meet unmet needs and to create new economic flows. They're all about building community while strengthening the local economy. And it just happens that it's very likely that Boulder County will be one of the first areas where some of these local currencies will be implemented, because we happen to have a county treasurer, Bob Hullinghorst, who is actually very, very passionate about local currency. And we're working with him and a steering committee to evaluate different proposals and to hopefully within the next year implement a local currency system in Boulder County, which I think will be the first of several, probably several local currency systems in the county. So that's the broad overview of the campaign, what we're attempting to accomplish here. We have been, over the last several months, supporting this with 3 to 6 public events per month, bringing in lots of speakers, putting together panel discussions, documentary films, classes and workshops, community dialogues, to bring these issues to more and more people. And of course, what we're doing this weekend, a Renaissance of Local, is sort of the cornerstone event for our campaign this year, and we've been building towards this since January, actually. And I just want to say that the Renaissance of Local, it's not just a festival, conference, and an expo, but we really see it as a gathering. It is certainly a gathering of extraordinary authors and speakers, some of the most important catalysts of our time. Many of them are not well known yet, but I think they will be in the future. Many of them, as you've seen, are local. It's also a gathering of forces, a joining of the energies of the Renaissance of Local that we're celebrating here, and we're kind of pouring it all into a cauldron here at Planet Bluegrass. And I think that our coming together here this weekend will have an impact in our future together. This is a gathering of people who have been touched, inspired, disturbed, or even somehow called by the nexus of issues around which this Renaissance has coalesced. Issues that I think represent humanity's evolutionary threshold. Hopefully, a Renaissance of Local as an annual event will be revolutionary, evolutionary, catalytical, participatory, collaborative, co-creative. What we're doing here is about nothing less than the great turning that David Korten points to, the deep economy that Bill McKibben writes about, and the blessed unrest that Paul Hawken has so eloquently revealed. Everyone is invited to what's happening here. Everyone is implicated. Everyone is involved. Why are we doing this? Because it's now undeniable that we must learn to reweave the fabric of fundamental connections and relationships that have been at the heart of human civilization from the beginning. We must learn to reconnect with the earth, with the seasons, with our biosphere, with each other. We must rebuild our relationships with those who live in our neighborhoods, with those who grow our food, with those who produce and sell the goods and services that we need. And we must all do it as locally as possible, rebuilding a local living economy. For it is only through profoundly local living that we can curtail our profligate consumption, that we can end our contribution to global warming, and restore balance and sanity to our planet. Our communities are being called to quickly become largely self-sufficient, to develop the capacity to produce locally our most essential needs. This is the heart of the relocalization movement and the impetus behind what we're doing here with the Boulder County Going Local campaign. The longer-term vision is that such relocalized communities will naturally trade their surpluses interdependently with surrounding relocalized communities, forming self-sufficient bioregions that trade surpluses with each other. This will be a radical and welcome shift from the tangled web of codependent relationships that we call a globalized economy. We are at the beginning, the very beginning, of an enormous transition to a much more localized economy in what we now know will be a carbon-constrained future. This transition to a local living economy will take some time, even though we don't have much time. We are all called here to make this transition possible, and it is thrilling to be here with you this weekend as we take on together this historic evolutionary challenge. And I'll close with my favorite quote from Paul Hawken, who unfortunately could not be with us this weekend. He said, "We can no longer import our lives in the form of food, fuel, and fundamentalism. Life is homegrown, always has been, and so too are the solutions to global problems." Thank you very much.
Thank you.